All right, diving right in today. We're taking a close look at how students in higher ed actually approach studying.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, you sent over that fascinating article, The Conceptual Basis of Study Strategy Inventories.
Right, by Entwistle and
Yeah,
what?
from way back in 2004. What really intrigued you about it was, well, basically getting a firm grasp on the different ways students learn, right?
Absolutely.
And the tools, that researchers use to actually identify those approaches.
Yeah, the inventories.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to really unpack the core ideas behind these study strategy inventories.
Sounds good.
See how this field has, well, changed over time,
Yeah.
evolved,
Show how it's developed.
and all those different perspectives that have shaped it.
Because I think, understanding these conceptual foundations, it's not just for researchers, it's actually really valuable for anyone involved in education. Like
Right.
for our listeners, it can give them some serious insights into, well, what actually makes learning effective. Yeah. Help them recognize those different study styles they see around them, maybe even their own learning preferences
For sure.
and all that, without getting lost in, super technical jargon.
Okay, so let's jump in. The article kicks off by pointing out that measuring study methods, it wasn't really doable until the 1930s.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it was the development of ways to, actually measure attitudes that opened the door for that.
So before that, it was just kind of like a guessing game.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And early research in this area,
No.
was all about how much effort students put in, how much they applied themselves.
Right, like diligence and all that.
Yeah, those were seen as the key ingredients for success, right?
Mhm.
And this was mostly attributed to things like motivation and study habits.
Okay, so the student was responsible.
Exactly. There was this prevailing idea that there were these, like, universally effective study methods, one size fits all.
Oh, wow, really?
That's kind of what they thought back then. And, this whole notion really paved the way for the first attempts to, well, categorize and measure these different aspects of studying.
It makes sense in a way. If you believe there's a right way to study, then the next step is to figure out who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong.
Exactly. And from those attempts, we got the first inventories.
Yeah.
Like in the U.S., back in '66, Brown and Holtzman developed one that looked at, things like work methods.
Okay, so how effectively students organize their studying?
Yeah, and also delay avoidance,
Procrastination, basically.
pretty much. And then there was teacher approval and educational acceptance. So yeah, pretty broad category.
But if you think about it, this makes sense in the context of, early educational psychology.
Uh-huh.
It was all about pinpointing those concrete behaviors and attitudes that seem to go hand in hand with good academic performance.
Right.
So work methods, delay avoidance, those are clearly about, well, effort, being organized.
Yeah, just like those early ideas we talked about.
Exactly. And then teacher approval and educational acceptance give us a peek into, well, how much the student was actually buying into the whole education system. Were they engaged?
That's a good point. Then over in Britain, in 1970, we have Entwistle and Entwistle. They kind of built on this, adding academic motivation to the mix.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and they connected it to achievement motivation. Basically, being driven to succeed and feeling good about your abilities.
Right, that inner drive.
Yeah, exactly. And their work started to hint that maybe it wasn't as simple as, just having good habits. They saw this really complex interplay between personality motivation and how a student actually studied.
So it wasn't just about doing the right things, but also about who you were as a learner.
Right. Like they found that, let's say, extroverts who were super motivated could perform just as well as introverts with the same level of motivation.
Even if their study methods were totally different.
Yeah, exactly. And this really challenges that earlier notion of, those universally effective study methods.
It starts to paint a picture of learning as a more individualistic process.
Absolutely. And their observation about anxiety was also really important.
Okay, how so?
Well, they noticed that for some students, anxiety could actually, push them to study harder, more conscientiously.
Ah, so like a motivator.
Yeah, but for others, it could be, well, really debilitating.
Yeah, leading to ineffective study habits.
Exactly. So, this complexity starts to move us away from that one-size-fits-all approach to learning.
Towards a more nuanced understanding of individual differences.
For sure. And then, cognitive psychology comes along and really shakes things up.
Yeah, that was a game changer.
Totally. Biggs, in 1970, he brings in those ideas about personality and motivation, but he also adds in those concepts from information processing psychology.
Right, like how our minds actually work with information.
Exactly. He thought of memory as this system with information, coming in through our senses, then being held briefly in short-term memory.
Or working memory,
Yeah, and then maybe, stored for the long term.
if we're lucky.
Yeah, right. And he also introduces this idea of, well, different levels of processing information.
Okay, like what?
So you have, surface level processing, which is just repeating things, rote memorization.
Got it.
And then you have deep processing, which is about analyzing and understanding the meaning, making connections.
So it's not just about taking information in, but about how you actually work with it.
Absolutely. And this actually lines up with that the distinction in educational psychology Ausubel talked about in 68 between rote learning and meaningful learning.
Right, so rote learning is just memorizing without really understanding.
Yeah, just surface level stuff. And meaningful learning, it's about connecting new information to what you already know, making it stick.
And this shift to actually considering, well, the mental processes involved in learning, it was huge.
Massive. And Biggs's own work on those inventories really reflects this change. Like his inventory, it evolved over time. He included scales for things like test anxiety and what he called arousal in terms of academic motivation.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and his learning categories, they started as fact rote and meaningful learning.
Makes sense, given what we just talked about.
Right. But later, he expanded it into this more detailed inventory. He had 10 subscales, all organized within 3 main areas.
Okay, let's break down those areas.
Okay, so the first one was utilizing.
Which was all about?
Well, it seemed to focus on this very um, practical approach to studying.
Like a means to an end?
Yeah, totally. Students in this category were driven by, getting good grades.
Makes sense.
And they tended to, like, accept information from teachers without really questioning it much.
Okay, so not very critical.
Not really. And they also experienced, anxiety related to their coursework.
So it was kind of a high-pressure approach, focused on just getting through it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The second area was internalizing.
And this was more about...
This is all about genuine interest, intrinsic motivation.
So the students who are actually fascinated by the subject.
Exactly. They had this real desire to understand, to delve deeper.
To really grapple with the material.
Yeah, and they were open to, different interpretations, alternative perspective.
More critical and curious.
Exactly. And then the third area was achieving.
Okay. What did that one look like?
This one was more about, well, the study skills linked to a student's need to achieve.
So things like time management, organization.
Exactly. Those kinds of behaviors that help students reach their academic goals.
So a more strategic approach.
Absolutely. Now, around the same time in 76, Martin and Selyo came along and introduced this incredibly important distinction between deep and surface approaches to learning.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about this.
Right. And they came to this through, well, actually observing students trying to learn, complex stuff in real-life settings.
So not just lab experiments.
No, like real-world learning situations. What they found was, well, the deep approach was all about the student's intention to really understand the material.
Okay, so it's not just about what they do, but why they're doing it.
Yeah, their underlying motivation. And the surface approach was, more about just reproducing the information, like for a test or something.
So it's that difference between cramming for a test versus really trying to grasp the concepts.
Exactly. And this focus on intention, it was a huge step forward in understanding how students learn.
It really shifted the focus from just observing behaviors to trying to understand the students' inner world, their goals, and their motivations.
For sure. Then you have Pask, also in 76, who identified these holist and serialist learning strategies.
Okay, remind me about those.
So the holists, they were the big picture thinkers,
Yeah.
the ones who like to see the whole forest before focusing on individual trees.
Uh-huh.
And they tended to be a bit more, well, impulsive in their approach.
Okay, more intuitive, maybe.
Yeah, something like that. Then you had the serialists. They preferred a step-by-step approach, more cautious, detail-oriented.
So like breaking down information into smaller chunks?
Exactly. And Pask pointed out that relying too heavily on either extreme could lead to, an incomplete understanding.
That makes sense. You need both the big picture and the details to really master a subject.
Absolutely. Now, all of this research really influenced Entwistle. He started looking at deep and surface approaches, not just as, reactions to specific tasks, but as more consistent habits that students developed.
So more like a general tendency or a preference?
Yeah, although he also acknowledged that these could change depending on the course, the lecturer, the assessment methods.
So the context still matters.
Oh, absolutely. And this led him to add a strategic approach to his model.
Okay, so students aren't just passively adopting deep or surface approaches, but they're also strategically adapting based on what they think the course requires.
Exactly. They're thinking about the demands of the situation. And all of this culminated in what we call the approaches to studying inventory, or ASI for short.
The ASI, yeah.
Yeah. When researchers used factor analysis on the responses, to identify those underlying patterns,
Mm.
they found three main orientations: reproducing, meaning, and achieving.
Okay, let's unpack those.
Okay, so reproducing, this was linked to that surface approach we talked about.
Right, just memorizing without deep understanding.
Yeah, heavy reliance on rote memorization. They tended to focus very narrowly on, what they thought was going to be on the syllabus, and their motivation was really external, driven by rewards or a fear of failing.
So more about getting through the course than really engaging with the material.
Yeah, pretty much. Then there was meaning, which was all about that intention to understand, truly grasp the concepts.
Okay, so deeper processing, connecting ideas.
Exactly. They were motivated by a genuine interest in the subject matter, intrinsic motivation. And then the third orientation was achieving.
And this is more about,
This is the strategic one. These students, they were super aware of what it took to get good grades. They were motivated to achieve.
so goal-oriented, organized.
Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, it was also negatively correlated with disorganized studying.
That makes sense. If you're strategic, you need to be organized to be effective.
Right. Now, the ASI also identified this less defined non-academic orientation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, which was kind of associated with, negative attitudes toward studying and linked to some of Pask's ideas about those less effective learning approaches.
Okay, so maybe students who are just not that invested in the whole academic experience.
Yeah, something like that. Then in 1987, Biggs, he actually adopted Martin's terminology, the deep surface and
That's
achieving.
its own inventory.
Yeah, for his study processes questionnaire, the SPQ.
Right, I remember reading about that one.
And he took it a step further, suggesting that each approach had both a motive and a strategy.
Okay, so the motive is the why, the reason behind the approach.
Exactly. And the strategy is how, the methods they actually use.
So for instance, with deep learning, the motive might be a genuine desire to understand.
Yeah, and the strategy might be actively relating new ideas to existing knowledge.
It's like he's saying that your reasons for learning directly shape how you go about learning.
That's a great way to put it. He even proposed this psychologic, connecting them. Like if your main goal is just to pass, the logical strategy would be to learn whatever you think is going to be on the test.
But if you're truly interested in the subject, you're more likely to try to learn as much as possible, regardless of tests.
Exactly. Now, later research, maybe questioned how rigid that link between motives and strategies always is. But the more recent, shorter version of his inventory, it still keeps that distinction for the deep and surface scales.
Okay, so the idea still holds some weight.
It does. It's also worth noting that around this time, things were developing on the U.S. side, too.
Oh, right. What was happening there?
Well, Schmeck and his colleagues, they were working on their Inventory of Learning Processes, the ILP,
Okay.
back in 1977. And they specifically applied, those ideas from information processing to academic studying.
So really focusing on how students were mentally engaging with the material.
Yeah. Initially, they differentiated between, deep or elaborative processing, how well students retain facts, which they linked to self-efficacy, and how methodical they were in their studying.
So a mix of processing styles and study habits.
Yeah, and this later evolved into the revised ILPR in 1991.
What changed with the revision?
Well, they used factor analysis and identified four main areas.
Okay, hit me.
So there was academic self-concept, how students felt about themselves academically.
Right, like their confidence and beliefs about their abilities.
Yeah. Then there was reflective processing, which included both deep and elaborative thinking.
So really engaging with the material on a conceptual level.
Exactly. Then there was this more passive approach they called agentic processing. And lastly, methodical study.
So similar themes to what we've seen with the other inventories, but with some unique elements as well.
For sure. And in later revisions, they actually broke down motivation and self-efficacy even further, and even started including social and emotional factors.
So they were really trying to get a more holistic picture of the student.
Absolutely. But, for some of those scales, the connection to what the other inventories were measuring became a bit less clear.
Yeah, it can get a bit messy when you have so many different frameworks and terms floating around.
Totally. Now, The purpose behind these inventories, it also started to shift a bit.
In what way?
Well, while the earlier ones were primarily about describing how students learn, just trying to understand their approaches,
Uh-huh.
Weinstein and her colleagues, they developed the Learning and Study Strategies Inventory, or LASSI.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
They actually made a direct link between the inventory and study skills training programs.
Interesting. So they were trying to connect assessment with intervention.
Yeah, exactly. They included a range of study strategies that are typically taught in these programs.
So things like note-taking, time management, that sort of thing.
Yeah, alongside ideas about how students process information.
Mm-hmm.
Lassie specifically looked at rehearsal strategies, like repetition, elaboration strategies, making connections,
Sure.
and organizational learning strategies.
So again, aligning with those main areas that Biggs and Entwistle identified.
Exactly. But the main focus of Lassie was on those study methods, although it did include some subscales on information processing and general academic motivation.
So it was a bit more practically oriented, geared towards helping students improve their study skills.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, with all these different inventories popping up, it's natural to wonder, are they all measuring the same things? Are they overlapping?
Right. Are they all just different ways of saying the same thing?
Exactly. And thankfully, there were several studies that actually compared them head to
Oh,
head.
interesting.
Yeah, like comparing the ASI with the ILP. And some studies even included Lassie in the mix.
And what did they find?
Well, some common themes definitely emerged. They found factors related to, being methodical in your studying, managing time well,
Huh.
having positive attitudes towards learning.
Okay.
And these were all negatively linked to, disorganized study habits.
So the organized and positive students tended to do better.
Yeah, pretty much.
Hmm.
Another common factor connected a surface approach: anxiety, fear of failure, and lack of planning.
Uh-huh.
And these were all negatively linked to deeper processing and, using good strategies for taking tests.
So those students were more likely to just try to get by without really engaging with the material.
Right. And then a third recurring factor was all about how students process information, relating ideas, elaborative thinking, and this is all supported by a deep approach and using evidence in their studies.
So again, we see those themes of deep versus surface processing emerging as really important.
Absolutely. And the article, it actually includes this really handy table.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I remember seeing that.
It beautifully shows, how these different inventories, despite the different labels and theories behind them, they all converge on some key study strategies.
It's like they're all pointing to the same underlying dimensions, just from slightly different angles.
Exactly. And the common threads are, that deep, reflective, elaborative approach versus the surface rote rehearsal-based approach.
And each comes with its own set of intentions and motives.
Right. And then you have that third element, studying methodically, being organized, which is linked to effort and achievement motivation.
It's like those three pillars of effective learning.
Now, as the field progressed, there was this noticeable shift toward emphasizing metacognition and self-regulation.
Okay, so becoming more aware of your own learning process and how to manage it.
Exactly. And while earlier inventories touched on these, indirectly, like time management is part of self-regulation,
Uh-huh.
the more recent ones really started to measure them explicitly.
So it became more about not just what you're doing, but how you're thinking about what you're doing.
Yeah, that awareness. And a key example of this is Pintrich's Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire, the MSLQ.
Right, from 91.
Yes. And this was developed from, those information processing ideas, but also incorporating this social cognitive perspective on motivation.
Drawing on a lot of previous research, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Including Weinstein and Mayer's work on those rehearsal, elaboration, and organization strategies.
So it's really building on what came before.
And what's really cool about the MSLQ is that it aims for this really comprehensive picture of both a student's motivation and their learning strategies.
Okay, so a two-pronged approach.
Exactly. On the motivation side, it looks at expectancy.
Things like self-efficacy, control beliefs.
Yeah, how confident students are in their ability to succeed, their beliefs about whether they can control their learning.
Got it.
Then it looks at value. So why are students engaging in the learning? Are they motivated by intrinsic interest or external rewards? And how much do they actually value the task itself?
In terms of interest, usefulness, importance.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, it looks at affect, mainly focusing on test anxiety.
Okay, so that emotional component.
Yeah. Now, on the learning strategy side, the MSLQ has scales that measure rehearsal, elaboration, organization, critical thinking,
Uh-huh.
and really importantly, self-regulation.
Which includes?
So that's planning their learning, monitoring their understanding as they go, and making adjustments if needed.
Okay, so really taking ownership of their learning.
Yes. And then there's a scale for effort regulation, which is that ability to, keep pushing even when things get tough.
That grit and determination.
Absolutely. Now, another significant contribution is Vermont's Inventory of Learning Styles, or ILS, from 1998.
Okay, what's unique about this one?
Well, he uses the term style to describe those relatively stable but potentially changeable ways students learn.
Uh-huh.
And he sees these styles as influenced by both personal characteristics and the learning context.
So it's not just about who you are, but also about the environment you're in?
Exactly. His model looks at mental models of learning orientations, regulation strategies, and processing strategies.
Okay, break those down for me.
So mental models of learning are about how students actually conceptualize learning itself, what they think it means to learn.
Like, some might see it as just absorbing information, while others might see it as actively constructing knowledge.
Exactly. Then you have learning orientations, which could be, getting a certificate, applying knowledge in a vocational setting,
Right.
or just being personally interested.
Okay, so their goals and reasons for learning.
Yeah. And then he looks at how they regulate their learning. Are they self-regulated, externally regulated, or lacking regulation?
So how much control they have over their own learning process.
Right. And finally, his processing strategies, they echo some of those earlier ideas with deep processing, surface processing.
Uh-huh.
But he also introduces this idea of concrete processing, which is tied to that vocational learning orientation.
So more practical, hands-on learning.
Yeah, exactly. Interestingly, when he analyzed the data from his ILS, he found patterns suggesting styles like meaning-directed learning.
Which is characterized by?
It combines self-regulation, deep and concrete processing, seeing learning as constructing knowledge, and being driven by personal interest.
So a very engaged and active learner.
Very much so. And then there was this reproducing directed style, which was more about surface processing, relying on external regulation, seeing learning as taking in information, and often motivated by getting that qualification.
So a more passive and externally driven approach.
Yeah, good summary. And then, we have to come back to Entwistle,
Of course, the ASI.
which has been refined and evolved into the approaches in learning, studying inventory, or ALSI.
Right, keeping up with the times.
Exactly. And that term orientation was swapped for the more commonly used approach.
Okay.
In the ALSI, it's designed to investigate how changes in the teaching and learning environment might influence the approaches students take.
So looking at how context shapes learning.
Yeah, very much so. The ALSI includes scales for a deep approach, which is all about understanding, relating ideas, using evidence.
Huh.
And it has a scale for monitoring studying, which taps into that metacognitive awareness we talked about.
Right, thinking about your thinking.
Exactly. And then there's surface approach, which is about unreflective studying, memorizing without understanding.
Okay.
And the achieving aspect is represented by scales for organized studying and effort management.
So still those core themes, but with a greater emphasis on the metacognitive and self-regulatory aspects.
For sure. And while most of the questions in the ALSI tend to load heavily on one of these main areas, there is some overlap, which makes sense because these aspects of studying are interconnected in real life.
It's not like they exist in isolation from each other.
Right. So, to wrap up this overview, it's clear that the development of these inventories, it took different paths in the U.S. versus Europe and Australia.
Yeah.
The U.S. ones initially drew more from psychological theories.
And the European and Australian ones were more driven by educational concerns.
Yeah, but those distinctions have become less clear-cut over time, especially with those newer inventories often blending both traditions.
It's like the field has become more integrated.
Definitely. And a big challenge in this area is, well, the terminology.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
Different researchers using different terms for the same thing.
And sometimes even the same term meaning different things depending on who's using it.
Exactly. It can get confusing. Ideally, a big factor analysis of all these inventories together would be amazing.
That would be helpful, but...
But as the article points out, it's just not practical with so many questions involved.
So we're left with comparing the content of the questions and using our judgment.
Yeah, pretty much.
Mm.
But despite those challenges, the research does suggest at least 3 main underlying dimensions that keep popping up.
Okay, which are...
So some version of a deep approach, a surface approach, and a strategic or achieving approach.
Right, those seem to be the core ones.
With that achieving approach, really emphasizing self-regulation, effort, concentration.
Uh,
And there's even the possibility of a 4th dimension, related to that practical vocational way of learning.
Which might be distinct from more theoretical approaches.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that the usefulness of these inventories, it hinges on this idea that students are relatively consistent in their study approaches.
But we also know that those approaches can be influenced by the learning environment.
Oh yeah, the context matters a lot.
So it's not just about who the student is, but also about the situation they're in.
Right. And learning and studying, they're complex processes. These inventories are valuable tools for understanding how individuals function in their learning environment.
But it's crucial to acknowledge their limitations.
Absolutely. So to summarize, we've taken this deep dive into the history and the ideas behind these different ways of measuring how students study.
Lots of different approaches and
Correct.
perspectives.
And we've seen how our understanding has evolved for those basic notions of effort and motivation to much more sophisticated models that include cognitive processes, metacognition, self-regulation,
It's a much richer picture of learning now.
for sure. And those recurring themes, deep versus surface learning, the importance of strategic approaches, they highlight those fundamental differences in how students approach education.
And here's something to ponder, given that these inventories have largely focused on those cognitive and motivational aspects of learning,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe haven't fully addressed the role of emotions.
So,
How might future research and new inventories incorporate that emotional side of learning?
interesting question.
Because, current educational psychology research tells us that emotions play a huge part in how we think and regulate our learning.
That's a good point.
So bringing in that emotional dimension could give us an even more complete picture of study strategies
Yeah.
and help us better understand how to support students in their learning journeys.
That's something to definitely think about.